Hello, my guppies, and welcome to Tigress on Tuk-tuk, a nature podcast for the Indian urbanite. I'm Sarah Mohan, and I'm a bit of a croaky guppy today, thanks to recovering from a cold. I've put off recording for this episode for as long as I could, and I've now convinced myself that I sound sexier than usual. Anywho, here we are on the last episode of Season 1. So bittersweet. Okay, let's jump right into it. Episode 1, we started at the beach, and for the season finale, we end in the sea. So, this episode idea was inspired by my own first diving experience. I have mixed feelings about that. But I had a ton of questions about life underwater, and so I fished around online, came across some writing by our guest, and I knew we simply had to chat with her about 20,000 things under the sea. Okay, not 20,000 things, maybe 20. Okay, maybe a few things under the sea. We hung out at her home in Bangalore, and I actually also interviewed her husband for the spider episode. Go back and check that one out if you haven't already. And ever since our chat about the ocean, we've just kept in touch. Ever so often we catch up about our nature journaling attempts. She sticks with it way more than I do. Talk about our favorite pop music. Thankfully, we're from a similar generation, so we know what the other is talking about. Things we see in our garden, potential collab ideas. I also unload on her about production woes, and she listens to every single episode and always gives me feedback. This woman's awesome. So this episode is kind of like a guided dive, starting with what it's even like to go diving. We then get into some of the underwater sights and sounds. It's also an incredible laundry list of various sea creatures and quirky, unexpected underwater partnerships that outdo the most ingenious human interactions. We also talked about the origin of sea sand and how the ocean is a giant fishbowl of poop and what we can do about the hellish relationship we now have with the ocean. Our guest is the best person to take us on this deep dive. She's a wildlife biologist, an ocean explorer, a PADI-certified dive master whose job it was to take newbies on their first dives, and also was a dive guide to certified divers. She originally started in research and worked with Dive India, but then fell in love with teaching, and that continues even today. She and her partner co-founded Spiders and the Sea, an organization that works towards bridging the gap between nature and people through storytelling, outreach, and education. Here's our incredible guest with her calm, collected confidence, her wry wit, that always gets shit done glint in her eye, and her fantastic stories, including this season's best ever name story. Here's my dear friend and exceptional human, Chetana Purushotham.
So my name is Chetana Purushotham, but in school I was called BP or blood pressure because the name that my parents gave for my ID card was Chetana BP. So for a very long time I didn't know what the B was for, and then I found out it stands for Babbarjang. So it's actually Chetana Babbarjang Purushotham. If I wanted to incorporate all the potential middle names that I've run through the family, they would also be Bele Huli.
What does that mean?
Well, actually,
Because Babbarjung sounds like he could be a cousin of Gabbar Singh from Sholay.
Tera kya hoga Kalia?
so the story goes that I'm forgetting now. It's either Hyder Ali or Tipu Sultan. So during that time, one of my ancestors used to work in his court, and he killed a tiger.
Whoa.
And okay, I don't remember if he used to work in his court, but he killed a tiger, apparently with his bare hands. And so everyone was really impressed. So he was summoned in the court, and then he was like given a pat on the back and say, "Wah, Babbarjang." And then, I don't know. So it was sort of like, I don't know if it's really a title or it was just something that he was so proud about. So for many generations, it's now been in my dad's family.
So you have some strong ass genes in you. That's all we need to know.
No tiger killing genes,
Right,
though.
of course not.
Yeah, for about 10 years, people in the sort of wildlife field have been calling me Chutney Pudi, or Chutney for short. So that's another name that goes around.
See? Best name story ever. So, for Miss Babarjung, this kind of all-consuming deep love for the deep blue was a fairly recent discovery. She didn't always think about the ocean like she does today, but she was always a water baby and spent much time in and by the water.
I learned to swim at the age of maybe 3 or 4 when we were in Delhi, and my parents used to take me to the Sports Authority of India pool in the winter.
Oh.
And
It's a true test of how much you love to do this activity. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it was the three of us, my father, mother, and me. So we would go, and I think I was the only one who came out comfortable. The trainer called my dad the Iron Man of India. No matter how much he tried, my dad would just always sink to the bottom. So yeah, and I did grow up in Chennai and spent a lot of my summer, Dasra and winter vacations there. And there would always be at least one trip to the beach or to Mahabalipuram. So I've spent a lot of time by the water. But for me, maybe up until my early 20s, I liked water and I would go to the beach, but in my head I actually never connected the two. If I would go to the sea, it would be to play around in the sand, maybe get thrown around by the waves a bit, because we were also, when you're with family, they're like, the sea is rough, don't go any further. So I was never afraid, but I sort of felt that this is the sort of zone you don't want to cross.
Sounds familiar, no? I have many beach memories with shouted out caveats of, Mole, don't go any further than that, okay? And rightfully so. Chetna was always inherently drawn to animals and nature and did her undergrad in environmental sciences, and along the way had opportunities to intern and volunteer at different places. Her master's in wildlife biology in Bangalore was a great taster of the various things one could pursue in the field. Before her course, she'd worked with renowned scientist Robin Vijayan and studied birdsong high up in the Western Ghats, and at one point thought that was her path. Until, in the third semester of her master's program, they went off for a few weeks to do a marine ecology field course in the remote Andaman Islands. You feel a life-altering catalytic moment coming on? Oh, yeah.
It's something that everyone, even before you get into the course, knows about, that at some point you're going to get to go to the Andaman Islands. For me, that was just exciting, get to go to these remote islands. I'd heard a lot about them, but I didn't really think much about it until my first dive in the Andamans. I wouldn't say first dive, actually, that dive course, because the first dive was a disaster. But once I started to get more and more comfortable, there was definitely one dive. It must have been the last in that entire course that I did, where everything clicked. So like how you were telling me about your dive in Pondicherry. So all of those smaller issues that I was facing somehow just went away, and I was able to, my buoyancy was so good that I felt like I was, just soaring through the water, not bumping into anything, not kicking up the sand.
Okay, so first dives, like mine in Pondicherry, are not always the easiest. It's of course important that you pick some place where the water is clear and preferably warm, but I also had issues adjusting to depth. This is normal, but I seem to be worse than most. My ears and the front of my head were just on fire, and I was freaking cold, like clattering teeth couldn't hold down snorkel cold. I went on and on about it to Chetna, and she assured me that with time, one does get acclimatized to this. So don't be disheartened if you've ever gone diving and your body didn't jump right into it, even though your heart did.
It was not just great, but something in my head clicked, saying, this is where I want to be, and I think I can do it. And the B, in a sense, was, this is where I want to work, but something about the ocean, it felt like this is what I want to dedicate my time and energy towards in some way. It came naturally.
See the line where the sky meets the sea. It calls me.
Now, Chetna didn't know what to expect to see on a dive, so she looked up a few photographs and could hardly believe her eyes.
So there was this one fish that didn't really look like a fish. It had stripes and it had these feathery tassels coming out of its body from all sides. And it was called a lionfish. Right. But I was like, that's probably a really rare thing. Yeah, most fish in the reef, in the ocean, look photoshopped. And another one that I saw called the yellow box fish. So I'll show you a picture. Just imagine a nice box That's yellow and black polka dots with a tiny triangular tail on one side and a tiny mouth, like a fishy kiss mouth on the other side, and two tiny fins.
Completely disproportionate. But
Yeah,
yes,
and it looks so wobbly yet graceful.
Right.
But in any case, I firstly didn't think these existed, and I never imagined that I'd be seeing them. And I saw both of these on my last dive in the Andamans and my first good dive.
Yeah.
And it was amazing.
I was lucky enough to spot a couple of lionfish on my dive, and they really are something. But hey, let's just dial it back a few steps and set the scene here. What's it like when you backroll your way off a boat and tumble blind into this incredible vast expanse you've never been in before? Once the splash bubbles clear, what's it like down there?
So what I'll describe to you would be something that you might see in a coral reef. So where a lot of the bottom that you're seeing is built by coral. So that's not necessarily what it might look like throughout India, because there are multiple places that you can go diving. But I think once you go in, the first thing that you'll notice is actually the reef itself. So you may not notice that these are corals, these are animals that you're looking at, because they're stationary and they just look like colorful rocks. But that definitely catches your eye because it looks like a sort of underwater mountain. Some places it might be a bit more flat, like a plateau, but in some places it actually looks like this mountain range, depending on how healthy or not so healthy / destroyed it is. But it is beautiful in all states of its health. The other thing that immediately catches your eye would be the schools of fish. So some places might have really large, sort of silvery shiny fish, which could be the predators in that area. But otherwise you have a lot of these tiny fish, which could be maybe palm sized or even smaller, which is why they usually hang around together in these either moving schools or hanging around as a shoal in one place. These could be damselfish. So Nemo is a clownfish, which is part of the larger family of damselfish. So these are really bright and colorful, dazzle in the sunlight. And usually when you see the fish, that takes up a lot of your attention. So once you get over that, initial
Just being starstruck.
just being starstruck, and what happens is that there is so much color and there is so much movement, and it's moving colors. You're probably enjoying it but not registering any one thing at the same time. So it's hard to describe, but that happens at least in the first 2 to 3 experiences underwater. So one is actually being comfortable with yourself underwater. That takes some time, and then you start to notice what's around you. And once you've gone past these couple of stages and you're comfortable enough to look at the smaller things, the finer details, you'll probably start to see the more stationary kind of animals. So you start looking, for instance, at the sand. Usually the sand is not the place that you'd want to look at. You're like, that you find sand on the beach, and usually there's not much that lives there.
Right.
But the truth is there's a lot, and you just have to sort of adjust your lens, change your search image a bit. So everything from sea cucumbers to sea urchins, sea stars, if you're lucky, maybe a stingray, which is usually hidden. So you need to sort of...
How so?
So usually if you find stingrays on sandy beds, so they have their mouths underneath. So they actually are sort of burrowing, and they use their fins, which look like wings, to sort of disturb the sand and look for the hidden critters, which could be, different kinds of crabs and shrimps. And so they have their eyes on top. So it could be to stay hidden from, prey, but also for predators. So they just need a few of those fin flaps to get enough sand to cover their entire body, so they stay hidden, except for their eyes.
So stingrays, grouped under rays and skates, are closely related to sharks, and unlike other bony fish, they've got a cartilaginous skeleton. So their entire body kind of feels like your ear. So while stingrays stay camouflaged in the sand or hide out in rocky caves, some other species of rays do hang out in the water column itself, and do the whole flying through the water with their wing fins like some kind of underwater archangel.
These would be the eagle rays. You also have mobula rays and manta rays, which are different from other stingrays.
Okay.
Yeah, they usually spend their time in the water column because they feed on plankton. So their mouths are actually sort of like a sieve. So you'll see them where there's a lot of nutrients and plankton sort of coming together. And all of those movements that you see of manta rays doing those barrel rolls, that's actually them feeding.
Rays usually are docile, non-aggressive creatures. They see you and they just swim away. Of course, many species do have those spines or barbs on their whip-like tails, which can deliver a nasty venomous poke, and it can be lethal, but this is usually only done in self-defense. Now, I'm calling this out because I know you're thinking about Mr. Crocodile Hunter Steve Irwin and the ray that unfortunately stung him to death. That was a freak accident, and witnesses like his camera person who was filming the whole thing say that the ray probably mistook his shadow for a shark and attacked.
Of all of the animals that I'm in awe of, I think the manta ray is like particularly special because of the first time that I actually saw a manta ray, and every time I've seen it after has been extraordinary. So they look like these really magnificent carpets, but they're actually animals, and they're swimming so gracefully in the sea, even if there's a really strong current and you're like, the equivalent of running underwater to stay in the same place, and the manta ray is just sort of like, it's a whole new world. And in one of these instances, I got quite close, and it just sort of looked at me, and then just circled around me and sort of went away. So I imagined that I wanted this tattoo of a manta ray sort of breaching the surface of the ocean, and it goes like completely spreads its wings or fins, and then there's this tiny little girl that's on the bow of a boat, like looking up at the manta ray. So that's the tattoo that I got.
Exactly like in Moana, but Chetana got her tattoo well before the movie came out.
What's on my side?
Yeah, I want to see it. Oh, I see.
Anyway. And then I saw this movie, and then there's this manta ray that's covered in bioluminescence, and then it sort of jumps up, and then Moana's on the boat. I was like, wait a minute.
This is my life. So, sand, we were talking about it. Where is all the sand coming from? And is sand getting in funny, uncomfortable places for all the creatures of the sea as well? Because it does for me.
Yeah,
so, does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, that is probably a highlight of any sort of beach experience for at least 20 years of my life.
So I'm wondering about all of these marine life. Are they all right?
That's actually something I never thought of. Like, what would animals do if sand goes into uncomfortable places?
Yeah.
I'm gonna look a bit closer next time.
Yeah, cracks and crevices.
Cracks and crevices.
They might not thank you for it, but...
So weather events like a hurricane bring up the sand a lot, right? And that could then get into, say, the gills of fish and clog them, or sand swirling about could block out sunlight in shallow waters and affect the productivity of corals. But otherwise, by and large, sea creatures are pretty good at living with sand, thanks to smooth, streamlined bodies, protective mucus layers, sand filters, and having far fewer cracks and holes than we do. Fish and crabs have got protective membranes which keep sand out of their eyes. Whales and dolphins have what's called a Harderian gland, which constantly bathes the eye in thick, oily, mucousy gloop, and this flushes out irritants like sand and sediment. Many other creatures simply filter it out. Soft-bodied creatures like mollusks have the ability to coat irritants, like a grain of sand, with certain smoothing substances, which makes them less irritating, eventually turning them into lustrous pearls. So, never will you ever spot a sea creature trying to discreetly pick out sand from their, special parts.
Get sand in my underpants.
There is, however, something very special about sand itself.
That's actually a very fascinating story in just the origin of sand, and you can tell a lot about sand just by looking at its color and its texture. For example, there are some places where the sand is completely white, and there are some places where the sand looks more brown, and that doesn't mean that one is clean and one is dirty. For instance, it just tells you about where that sand is coming from. So white sandy beaches are basically getting their sand predominantly, say, from the ocean. So this is calcareous, it's made of calcium. Right. So it could be from years and years of coral breaking down, of shell fragments from different kinds of mollusks, snails that build their shells. There are many animals in the ocean, and even some plants. So there are some kinds of algae that make calcium skeletons on the inside, which is actually really bizarre. So there's one called Halimeda. So it could be to give them some sort of structural support. It could also be because they then may not be that palatable. So they look like tiny, cactus in the water. And when they die and you see that green pigment fade, you can actually see the white sort of skeleton.
Kind of like our bones then, basically.
Yeah, much thinner. And this will also eventually crumble and become part of the sand. And you also then have animals that feed on, say, reefs, for example, where it could be feeding on this algae that's on coral rocks, or even sometimes just directly, going out and eating coral, where you will have bits of calcium going into their system. So what they then do is some animals like parrotfish are able to actually sort of crush this and make it fine sand, which will come out in the form of poop.
Those crunching sounds you're hearing are parrotfish scraping algae off a coral, and also biting off chunks of coral like it were potato chips. I've linked the BBC Earth video in the show notes. You should have a look at these guys. But they're brightly coloured tropical fish, named so for their parrot beak-like fused front teeth. Many species are highly threatened due to overfishing, because they are a delicacy in some cuisines and also popular in the pet trade. Harvesting parrotfish is banned in some parts of the world, but a lot more needs to be done to protect these herbivores who keep corals algae-free and our beaches full of poop. Sand.
And surprisingly, there are quite a few studies done in the Maldives and done in Hawaii that shows that a significant proportion of the sand that you see in lagoons, in the shallow reefs, and even on beaches actually have been transported by parrotfish.
Oh,
and
wow.
you need...
So they kind of have a quality to them which tells you that they came out of a parrotfish's butthole?
So you can tell the origin of those fragments, what kind of animal it possibly was. Amazing. And who brought it there. So and it's not something that happened in the past and stopped. It's very dynamic, and it actually should continue to happen with time, because if you don't see that happening, that's when your beach is going to start eroding. So you need tons of fresh sand to be deposited every year.
Can we ever run out of sand? Is that what you're saying?
In a way, we now can run out of sand if we remove enough sand that is not being replenished.
Right.
And that's the white sand, right?
Right.
That's from the ocean. It's sort of calcium origin. But you also have a sand that's from continents, that's of terrestrial origin. So a lot of this can have silica, and this comes just from the minerals that we have on land.
Right.
And that's the one that you'll find that's a lot more browny.
I see.
And there are parts of the world that you have slightly dark brown to black sand, and that's volcanic in origin.
Oh, right. So when, like in the Andamans, for example, does it get rocky then when you go further out, and do you see sandy floors, or is it a mixture of?
So it's usually a mixture. So in most reefs that you might get a chance to go to, it'll be a matrix. So a coral reef, the ecosystem in itself will have these smaller habitats. So you'll have the rocky habitat, which might have a lot of crevices and caves, and you'll have these sand patches that are right next to them.
Nice.
So if people are coming to dive, immediately they may not take to the idea of going and diving in sand, so usually start off in coral reefs.
Right.
But I think over time that has given this idea that coral reefs are extremely rich. That's where all the animals are, but it's just one of many shallow water ecosystems. So right in India you also have seagrass, which you find at similar depths In fact, much shallower also. And there's tons of stuff to see there.
So, seagrass beds or meadows are basically underwater grasslands found in shallow coastal waters. These swathes of marine grass are not seaweed, which are a type of algae, but actual, has root, shoot, leaves, flowers kind of vascular plants. Highly productive, nutrient rich, these marine gardens are home to small creatures like fish, crab, and shrimp, but also are favorite feeding grounds for large turtles and mammals like dugongs.
Coral reefs, seagrass beds. Can you maybe zoom us in a little bit and talk about some of these really fascinating / bizarre / cute / slightly out of a horror film sort of creatures that you might have encountered, and the relationships that they kind of have there? It's all interconnected, isn't it, a lot of the time?
I don't think I've seen anything that I feel is right out of a horror film. I will say some animals look a bit alien-like in the sense that you wouldn't think that this is found on Earth, but I think invariably I have a bias, but everything looks cute or beautiful and bizarre in a really good way.
So who are some of your top favorite ETs underwater?
I think one of my favorites, which sometimes spooks other people, is the worm sea cucumber.
Okay.
So normally you would think of sea cucumbers as, if you visualize the vegetable, they're cylindrical, they're mostly full of water, and they're about a foot long, sometimes a bit longer. But a worm sea cucumber can grow to up to a couple of meters, so it looks more like a worm.
Kind of like a chubby snake baguette hybrid, I'd say. They've got a mouth on one end and a bumhole at the other. They are rather sluggish, moving slowly along the seafloor. And at the mouth end, they've got a ring of feathered tentacles.
So sea cucumbers are, in a sense, detrivores. So they're feeding on dead and dying, decomposing matter, and a lot of it is already inside the sand. So imagine they look like tentacles, but they have feathers.
Wow.
Each tentacle sort of has feathers, and they're probably a bit sticky, so they're constantly rolling them in the sand and picking up these grains of sand and other particles and then sending them into their mouth. So it was actually quite hypnotizing. So you can actually just constantly watch it because, some tentacles are going in while others are coming out, and it's just absolutely beautiful. But if you spook them, they will instantly go back in. So that's their sort of defense. The one that you get in the Andamans, if I'm not wrong, one of them is called the Godfrey's worm sea cucumber.
Okay.
They also have these legendary names.
Yeah.
So, do we have any insect equivalents in the ocean?
So we have crustaceans. So you've got crabs and shrimps and lobsters. One that often gets mistaken for a kind of insect would be sea slugs, especially nudibranchs. So these are mollusks. They are related to octopus and squid and cuttlefish. But these are groups of animals that don't have shells. So they're cousins of snails, but most of them have lost their shell through evolutionary time. Invariably, they're extremely colorful. And some of them actually take on this sort of neon hue. Like, pick a color, there's probably a slug that has at least 3 shades of it on its body. And like with some species of butterflies that you get on land, this is usually a signal to predators saying that, I'm toxic, so if you try to eat me, either you're going to get a stomachache or, I don't know, you might die. Some of them can grow as big as your palm, maybe even bigger. But a lot of them are just about, pinky finger size or, thumb size. And nudibranchs essentially are a subgroup of these slugs who have their gills or a breathing apparatus outside their body, sort of where you would imagine their bum to be. And nudibranch because it's naked gills. So their breathing apparatus is located outside the body. And they have... It looks like antennae on the front of their body. So, but they're actually called rhinophores, which is the organ that helps them smell their food.
Wow. Okay.
So initially looking a bit insect-like. If I had to pick a favorite, animal to go look for, because they're really small, but they're actually very common, and all you have to do is actually sort of slow down. So you can't do a brisk swim in the water. So you have to actually go so slow that you're not actually moving at all. You're just letting the water sort of take you, and not just look at them and say, okay, sea slug, and tick it. But you can actually, if you wait long enough, you can actually see them going about their day. And that's actually what I enjoy doing when I go diving. So it's not so much trying to go on this safari to try and see as many different things as you can, but try and go as slow as possible to sort of blend into that system, so that rather than them getting sort of spooked by you, you are actually just a sort of fly on the wall, and they're just going about their day, which could be feeding, it could be mating, it could be competition, but I particularly like seeing symbiosis.
We did sort of touch upon this in episode 1 as well. Competition, symbiosis, these are all types of interactions that creatures have with other living things and non-living things in their environment. Symbiosis, for instance, is a long-term association, a partnership between two different species, usually with benefits to both, or at least one of the parties involved.
So there are some very textbook examples of symbiosis, like the clownfish that lives in the anemone, which is another animal. So they give shelter to clownfish, and in return the clownfish in a way acts like a bodyguard. So the movement that you see that clownfish makes, sort of darting out of the anemone, is not them like being happy or doing a dance or saying come closer, let's play. That's actually them sort of protecting the anemone, which is also their territory. So they probably have eggs nearby, or they have young as well, and so they're actually great multitaskers, because these clownfish are not only protecting their young, their anemone, from predators, they are also constantly keeping the anemone clean. So if you find bits of rocks or something that's fallen in, they're also constantly cleaning that. In return, they inadvertently end up providing food to the anemone in the form of their poop, their metabolic waste. Anemones are again cousins of jellies and corals. So anemones actually have stinging cells on all of their tentacles, which actually is quite a good defense, and smaller fish can actually get stung or can die. But the clownfish actually sort of immune to this. So every anemone might have a family of clownfish that live with them, and they sort of have a signature. There is every chance that the anemone might think of the clownfish as an intruder and sting them, but they don't, because there is a sort of mucus layer that surrounds each of these fish, but they do need to still keep reminding the anemone of their presence, which is why they keep moving and slithering through their tentacles. So it's sort of constantly keeping their association fresh and intact.
Right.
Another example is schooling, or fish hanging out in structured groups, swimming in the same direction with the same speed in a coordinated manner, each fish precisely spaced from its mate. As kids, we try to recreate this for March Past on Sports Day. The poor teacher yells herself hoarse about one-arm distance and left-right lefts in unison. There's only so far we'll go. We ain't fish.
So schools of fish, similar to when birds fly in a flock, it is not random. It is not arbitrary, group of individuals that just decide, to go this way or that. There's tons of research, especially, more and more recently, to show that it's actually quite sophisticated. There is a lot of decision making that goes into how schools work, and it isn't like there is one leader that's telling everyone where to go. So it's actually it's sort of decentralized. So each individual is making a decision simultaneously, and that is what emerges as a school's decision.
Reading the environment and the vibes of others in your community and acting based on all this for the greater good sounds like an impossible concept, and a pro tip for our governments and lane discipline on our roads. So these are split-second, instantaneous decisions, and fish have the sensory power to do it, not just through their sense of smell or vocalizations, but a super sense. And chances are, if you eat fish, You've seen it.
Fish that move in schools can actually also sense each other's vibrations. They have this sort of line that goes through the side of the body. So if anyone eats seafood, if you look at the flank, you'll actually see the sort of line that goes from behind the head, sometimes all the way to the tail.
Yeah.
So that's actually almost like a sixth sense that they have. It's called the lateral line system.
Oh.
And it basically can tell when there is a change in the water around them, which could happen because of the movements of animals around them. And what they have found is that schools that are larger are able to make better decisions.
Really?
Yeah, so
Okay.
smaller the schools, which might happen when fish go missing, because of overfishing or whatever the reason might be, they start to make like poorer decisions, which means that they're likely to make a decision that might result in death.
Right. So, schooling usually involves fish of the same species, but some partnerships involve completely unrelated species that look like they have nothing to do with each other, but each desperately needs the other for their survival. Enter the goby and the shrimp.
So gobies are really tiny fish. They're again about 1 finger length, and you'll usually find them in the sandy areas. And this particular kind of goby, a family of gobies, is usually partnering with shrimps. These are called partner shrimps. And if you were to imagine how they look, they'd have one really large pincer. So one really large arm with a sort of extended claw.
Right.
So that's sort of their working arm. They probably also use it for combat. But essentially how this partnership works is that shrimps are excellent at burrowing, which you need to do in the sand, because every time, waves come in and out, the tide changes, you're going to have a mini avalanche again. So they are really good architects and very hardworking, so they're constantly sort of shoveling out the sand. So they make excellent burrows, but they don't have very good eyesight.
Oh.
But that's where the goby comes in. So the goby is also a sand dweller, but cannot really burrow. But it has excellent eyesight. It can be really quick, so it acts as the watchman. So their common names are actually watchman, goby, and partner shrimp. The shrimp is usually the one that's constantly digging, maintaining the burrow. And if this is a very dynamic watery area where there's going to be a lot of sand constantly falling in, they'll actually go through the extra step of fortifying the entrance of the burrow with bits of shells, bits of coral rock, and so all of this would require the shrimp to come out of the burrow, sometimes a couple of feet outside to gather all of these things. But it'll do all of this only when it gets a green signal from the goby. So the goby is actually always positioned right at the entrance of the burrow, constantly looking around, and they communicate with each other mostly through contact. So the shrimps have an extremely long set of antennae, which can sometimes be as long as the rest of its body. And no matter where it is, there is a part of its antennae that's always in contact with the goby.
When the coast is clear, goby uses a combination of bum wiggles and tail flicks, which shrimp picks up with its antenna. Morse code for fish, Chetana calls it. So tactile signals like these are one way to communicate, but we've recently discovered that fish actually also have a whole repertoire of vocalizations, and I'm not talking about echolocating dolphins and singing whales.
There could actually be vocalizations being used in reef fish, which could again be something to communicate with others in your school, from one end of the reef to another, mating calls. For different species, it has been identified from grunts and clicks to quacks, and this is all very recent, because most people would say that when you go underwater, the thing that I like the most is the silence, or the sound of your own breathing, which is what we hear, but that's actually not the sound that the others are hearing. So reefs and even other parts of the ocean can be quite busy just in terms of the sounds that the animals make. We were just not, I think, listening in the right frequencies.
So these are actual fish sounds that people have picked up using devices called a hydrophone off of coral reefs. You've got to check out this video from BBC's Earth Unplugged. Okay, so in the Andamans, Chetana also did a lot of night dives. So I had to ask her about night shifts in the ocean.
What happens once the sun goes down? Is it a party?
So actually, to begin with, I think the color when you see at night, at first can feel like absolute darkness. But after your eyes sort of adjust, there's actually a lot more light than you'd expect, especially on nights when the moon is out. You actually can manage quite well, but you always do need to use a torch. I will just say that right now for your own safety and so you don't hurt any of the other animals. So the night shift on the reefs, it's a shift. There's a complete turnover or change in the animals that you see. So all the animals and most of the animals that you would see during the daytime have basically gone to sleep. They've gone into hiding until the sun comes up again. And the animals that you see at night, in many places you won't see as many. Initially it would look like, there's not anything to really see. But that's when you have to sort of start getting used to seeing in low light. The first thing that I usually see when I go underwater are all of these tiny crustaceans. So if you were to go for a walk on land in a forest, sometimes you see these eye shines, right?
Yeah.
Which could be different kinds of mammals, or it could be spiders. But in the ocean, when you see eye shines, it's usually some crustacean. So it could be crabs or shrimps. A lot of crabs are a lot more active at night, especially the really larger ones. They're doing something very similar. They're eating the dead and decaying matter on the sand, scraping food off rocks and stuff.
So at night, don't go around looking for fish, It's loads of other creatures that are out and about.
One of my favorite animals to see underwater at night are urchins. So urchins have these tall spikes and they are venomous, again, for defense. They all mostly are herbivorous. So their mouth is at the bottom and they actually scrape algae off of rocks. So imagine, what is that new cleaning device?
Oh,
the
that
Roomba. No.
Yeah. Correct. Something like that.
Something like so. Imagine an urchin to look like that. So
Right.
the spines are for their defense. So you don't want to get punctured by any of them. You won't die, but it can be painful. But they look like a shiny disco ball at night. So they have these smaller filaments that could be, green and purple, iridescent. Shiny disco ball. The funky part about the urchin to look at is bumhole, which is actually right on top
Of course.
of this little Roomba, and it looks like a single eye. It looks like a third eye that's constantly sort of moving, and it can inflate, it can distend. It's a lot of action in one animal. When you use your torch, you can actually spot a lot of these animals that during the day I think would be hidden in plain sight. So some venomous animals like stonefish, scorpionfish. Some of these actually do come out a bit more at night. They, so in the Andamans, there was one particular dive site that we would do night dives at. So we would be diving there during the day, then come back, have lunch, and then head out in the evening again. So the same rock that we would have gone past numerous times in the morning, that we knew exactly what would be there, you would now see a completely different set of animals. So all of these sort of become like protagonists at night. And a lot of these animals are feeding on plankton. So, and you will see them quite active after dark because a lot of plankton actually start to come to shallower areas at night. So this is a sort of vertical migration that you see, and globally speaking, this migration of plankton from the deeper sort of stretches in the ocean to the almost till the surface is supposed to be, the largest migration on land, on Earth. Yeah. So they do this because during the day, shallow areas can have a lot of predators. So a lot of these fish that feed on plankton, which during the day have sort of retreated, so they would come up to the surface at night.
Plankton form the very base of the marine food web. Planktos in Greek means drifter, and drift is what they do best, freely allowing the currents to move them along. Plankton can be one of two types: phytoplankton, which are plants and photosynthesize, and zooplankton, which are animals and eat phytoplankton and in turn get eaten by other creatures. Now, they're mostly microscopic, but if you're wondering what they look like, their shapes really are out of this world.
Because the plankton can sometimes be like really tiny glassy shrimp, or these alien-like tiny cups with wings. I mean, it's hard to describe because it could be any form that you want to imagine. So there's a lot more plankton action at night. So a lot of animals that feed on plankton become a bit more active, and these include coral. So corals during the day might just look like colorful rocks with really nice textures and these repetitive sort of honeycomb patterns. At night, these sort of open out and you start to see their tentacles come out. So corals are like anemones and jellies. They have tentacles that they use to sting plankton. And a coral, it's hard to describe whether it's one animal or it's a set of animals. So usually corals live in colonies. So each individual is a polyp. And each of these have these tentacles. So at night it looks like a velvety sort of cushion because all of their tentacles come out and it's like a rock that has fuzz on it. And these are constantly moving and they have stinging cells as well. So when plankton get a bit too close, becomes food. So corals during the day don't actively feed, but they have a symbiotic sort of algae that lives in them that produces food for them. So this is where it gets confusing. Is coral an animal or a plant? But in its living form, most corals are a combination of the coral animal and the symbiotic algae that lives inside their tissues.
So the algae associated with corals is a tiny microscopic creature called zooxanthellae. These also give corals most of their colors. These zooxanthellae can be found free-floating in the ocean, but prefer to live in corals as that's the safer bet to survival. And all they have to do in return is produce extra food for their polyp friends. Not a hard ask because they can photosynthesize. Now, this really is the mother of all symbiotic partnerships.
So it's because of this partnership that corals are actually able to, grow this fast, produce these huge calcium skeletons, and which is why coral reefs, as we know them, are found in shallow areas, so that the zooxanthellae that live in them can get good access to sunlight. So this happens during the day, but they still do feed at night. And there are some corals that you would find slightly deeper down that don't have this symbiotic zooxanthellae or don't rely on them that much and actually need to feed on their own a lot more.
These are called deep sea corals or cold water corals, found even at depths of 20,000 feet, where the water is icy and sunlight nearly non-existent.
What can we as urbanites, regardless of how close or far away from the sea we live, what are some of the things that we can think about just to improve the kind of pressures that we're putting on our oceans at the moment?
I think the first thing to do, like you just mentioned, is to actually think about it. Because I think for many of us, we could go through days or weeks, I don't know, even years not really thinking about the ocean because it probably seems like it doesn't really have a bearing on our lives. But I think the first thing to do would actually be to learn a bit more about, if not about the ecology of the ocean, just how we interact with the ocean. And in terms of the pressures or the threats that are looming right now, with regard to the ocean, I would say the biggest is climate change. Climate change has this large umbrella, but underneath that we have the fact that the ocean is warming. We have the fact that the ocean is becoming more acidic. And there are, these bunch of smaller ways in which each of these two processes are influencing the ocean. But from coral reefs dying, in large numbers because the corals and their sort of zooxanthellae are not able to take the heat. And so that entire symbiosis essentially breaks down, which ultimately results in the coral animal dying in really large numbers. So that's happening because the temperature of the water is going up. And with increasing carbon dioxide being absorbed by the ocean and the temperature going up, the water is also becoming acidic. So with all of those animals that we were talking about that have calcium skeletons, either the skeletons produced are going to be brittle or whatever, and whatever is already existing is going to slowly dissolve.
So literally, the ocean is turning into a boiling acidic cauldron, slowly dissolving various creatures, right from microscopic plankton to corals to shelled organisms. Okay, so these are problems we can't actually see happening and we don't think about every day. But what about the in-your-face things like pollution? I mean, if you've been to a beach recently, I bet the most common thing you saw around was garbage and not shells. Then there's things like digging, drilling, ill-planned development, and activities that cause other disturbances in the ocean. Also, overuse of marine resources, most importantly, overfishing. What can you and I do about this depressing stuff?
So I'm of the belief that as much as we have to sort of push for policy level, governance level change to take place, at the same time, individual action should not stop. It could start overall with the lifestyle that we lead. I find it hard to think of, sort of action points to give people, because I think when you identify a problem and start to understand it a bit more based on your own experiences and where you are, you can actually come up with a solution that makes sense for you. Which I think would be my sort of broad answer to how to help tackle climate change.
Right.
Look, we've all heard the solutions 1,000 times, and Chetana reiterated them all. Things like cutting down how much waste we generate, most of which eventually reaches our oceans, reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, holding governments accountable, travelling responsibly, supporting local organisations that follow eco-friendly practices. Yes, these things take planning and effort, and we are well past the time to get off our butts and do it. Now, of all these problems, there's one that I think people don't realize how much they have the power to influence change in the way it's practiced. Chetna shines light on this beautifully.
With the aspect of seafood, I would never tell anyone to stop eating seafood.
Right.
I don't think it makes sense for the entire world to just stop eating something that, as far as I know, we've been eating since the start of, from the Stone Age.
Yeah.
But definitely there is an issue now of the scale at which this entire sort of fisheries sector is functioning. A lot of it actually can be influenced by how we demand for seafood. Right? It's not like we are eating seafood only because someone is going out and bringing it. They are not going to fish unless there is someone to buy it, because then all of that effort and money is going to waste. So you have something called seafood calendars, which I think have been used throughout the world, and now you actually have them in India. You have one that's called Know Your Fish, which you can use if you're on the west coast, and then you have one more called In Season Fish, which you can use on the east coast, but I think it also applies to anywhere else in India. So taking factors like the type of fish it is, or any other kind of seafood, whether it's shellfish as well, knowing when it breeds, what kind of fishing method is used, and if at all, if there's any other sort of marine life that is caught along with it, but that goes to waste. Nearly half, I'd say 40 to 45% of the seafood that is extracted often goes to waste through the entire process, which is called bycatch. Taking all of these into account, making these recommendations. So you could actually look at this calendar, see what month you're in, and there would be a list of species that they would recommend that you eat, and list that they would say, avoid this because this animal is breeding right now, so you want to give it some time until it's able to go through its entire breeding cycle. And if enough number of people do this, it can actually shift the way in which markets run. Evidence for this, that it'll actually work. There's a really nice example that one of the founders of Know Your Fish, Mayuresh, he often quotes. So studies have shown that if you look at the state of Maharashtra, in the months of August, which is when you have the Ganesh festival, there is a significant dip in the seafood market, and that's because people actually don't demand seafood. So fishermen actually do not go as often, as much during that time, and similarly there is a spike during Christmas. So if we are able to make a dent in how the sort of demand supply runs based on a sort of cultural or say religious context, why can't we now do this keeping an ecological context in mind? So when it comes to, say, seafood, no matter where you live, following something like a seafood calendar and actively maybe propagating it to people around you if you don't eat seafood is one definite way in which you can start to make change.
Change starts now.
Collapsing fisheries all over the world are on the brink of total catastrophe and can do with some radical change. So whatever else you think might be hard to start doing right away, this, figuring out the right fish to buy so that your lunchtime mean curry doesn't fuel the collapse of entire fish populations, this is stupidly easy to do. Fish calendars. Someone's done all the work. You just need to pull it up on your laptop, print it out if you must, stick it on your fridge, give your grandma a copy, follow it to the T. I've linked the websites of both Know Your Fish and In Season Fish in the show notes. Please get your sea calendars today and tell everyone about them.
When I think about it, it sounds like everyone is swimming in this giant infinity pool in their own poop and everyone else's poop.
Fish pee in you all day.
Yeah, poop is nothing but a set of nutrients that's at the base of any food web. And poop can come in different ways. So when I was telling you about the sea cucumbers, they are constantly pooping as they feed on, this decomposing matter. And they poop out the sand. That's actually a very important process that sort of continues the food, the cycle.
Right.
And that poop is going to look like beads of sand, like a pearly sandy necklace.
Oh.
Sometimes poop can look like noodles.
Oh.
Tiny piles of noodles.
Yum.
Sometimes all you can see is poop because the animals are buried in the sand or somewhere hidden in the rock. So there's
But
poop
like if
everywhere.
a whale swam past you and just let it out.
Yeah, that you're going to see for hours,
right.
yeah. But all of that actually, when I look at poop in the water, or maybe even in the forest, to be fair, all I see is that, this is food for someone else. And in the ocean, poop, which, eventually results in these nutrients for smaller plankton, and then these plankton can, be food for zooplankton. And then when I do see a lot of plankton in the water, and even if you don't see them because they're really small, it might feel like something's biting you, like mosquitoes in the water, like tiny pinches, then I know that, I might actually see something really cool, like a manta ray or a school of mackerel, that are tracking these sort of blooms of
So
plankton.
that would be a clue to being surrounded by
Yeah.
plankton?
Yeah. So these are like indicators that you can actually use.
Nice.
So if I see poop, I'd probably hang around.
Follow the poop, yeah. Okay. Sounds good. Well, this has been so much fun, and it's more than everything I was hoping that this could be. So thank you so much for doing this.
This was
Chetana.
fun. Thank you for
Yeah.
thinking of me.
Always been on my wish list. Thank you.
Yay.
Chetana and I have now made a pact to go snorkeling together sometime, and I cannot wait. You can follow her work and adventures on Instagram at Spiders and the Sea. I've linked a bunch of her stories, which you should also check out for some amazing pictures of life underwater. Okay, you guys, this has been such an incredible season, not just for this show, but in my life as well, thanks to producing this podcast. A big thanks to all my guests so far for these amazing conversations. The show's artwork is by the very talented Gemma Jose. This Earworm title track was produced by Prithvi Chandrasekhar. Big thanks to them both. And thanks to all of you so very much for listening to the show, for sticking with me so far and making all my podcast dreams come true. All the listeners who've left reviews and ratings or reached out either on Instagram or the website saying such crazy awesome things about the show. You have the same effect on me as a freshly baked cookie. You fill my heart, make me go warm and fuzzy, and totally determined to get back soon with season 2. And I promise there will be more amazing conversations. Keep track of things on Instagram at Tigress on Tuk-tuk. Hopefully there will be some content put out there. I almost don't want to sign off. Okay. I'll catch you real soon. Bye-bye.